लेकिन उन्होंने एक्सेप्ट नहीं, मतलब डेस्क पे गई थी। उसके अलावा बाकी उन्होंने एक्नॉलेज भी किया, लेकिन उसमें नहीं आया, न्यूज़पेपर में नहीं आया। मैंने चेक किया है।
All right, we're ready whenever you're ready.
Who's going to take the... Good. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this session here called Instead of Aid, Why Not Trade? My name is Matt Warner. I'm president of Atlas Network, and I'm very excited about the guests that we have today to discuss these topics. Of course, when you look at the broader landscape of international aid, there is lots of evidence to challenge its efficacy, lots to challenge whether it's undermining democracy. But if you actually think about and look at some of the studies that have been done related to, on the other hand, the landscape of trade, many have made the observation that if we would just open up trade more and limit some of the restrictions and penalties that we put on people's opportunity to exchange freely, we would far outdo any potential good that any hope to do with aid. For a good summary of this, you can read the Innis lecture by Nathan Nunn, Harvard's Nathan Nunn, where he talks about just one example where a U.S.-initiated effort to stop what they would call dumping from catfish farmers out of Vietnam had the effect of decreasing their income by 40%. And Nathan Nunn makes the point that if we could find an aid intervention that increased Vietnamese catfish farmers' income by 40%, that would be a huge success story. And yet here, such an opportunity exists if we just started to think a little bit differently and smarter about how we treat each other in the trade space. Well, we have with us three experts from the Asia region, Prashant Narang with the Center for Civil Society in India, Dr. Sarath Raja Patarana from Advocata Institute in Sri Lanka, and Philippa Amanta from the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies in Indonesia. And we're going to have a lively conversation today. And I'm going to start with just a broad opening question. If we accept the premise that increased open trade is a net positive for the world, how optimistic are each of you from the perspectives of the work you're doing that increased free trade is on the horizon? Are there unilateral opportunities that you see to achieve some opening in your country? Or do you see the multilateral and bilateral opportunities sort of getting back online soon? They've been a little bit stagnant with the WTO of late. Just give us your quick take on how optimistic you are about the near future. And we'll start with Dr. Raja Patarana.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I feel very excited to participate in the discussion. I think I'm older than any one of you, and I have been in this group work for a long time. You referred to the case of, I just comment on it, about the case of Vietnam and the catfish. I was then leading economic missions on the World Bank to Vietnam. That's a totally trumped up case. Actually, they were arguing from Louisiana that the Vietnamese catfish were not catfish. But the good result was that when they went to the panels held on the side of Vietnam. And it showed that the WTO system in that case worked very well. So let me go to the earlier question that was raised by our chairman. I am not very hopeful. I'm talking about Sri Lanka first, because Sri Lanka was the second country in the world to liberalize its trade regime in 1977. And the first developing country to do that was Chile in 1974. And so from 1977 to say 87 or even 88, 89, it worked well. Why do I say it worked well? Not only looking at the increase in the ratio of exports and imports to GDP, but there was an enormous increase in productivity. And we had not had the productivity increase like that before, because by liberalizing trade, we were able to allow, take away any restrictions on people to invest, invite foreign guests to come and support both exports and import substitution efficiently. So I am not hopeful now, first of all, because immediately we have a COVID case that is going on that's hitting many countries, and the countries are not fully open to change at this moment. But I think this will also end, as I say, this will also end like other things. Then it depends upon the leadership. Our leadership is not really excited by liberalizing trade. There is a sort of ideological position that goes back to our colonial times. They have equated liberal economic policies with those times, unfortunately. So while I do not believe they are all about to agree to trade liberalization, when this government were to finish its term and not win the next election, then there will be enough people and who will be able to participate. I already know people who are interested in doing that. We at Advocata also advocate about it all the time in other places. So while it is not immediately, I don't see in the card for us, I think the world will see that as you increase the ratio of world trade to world GDP have always risen. And so we will enter such a situation, maybe 2-3 years of our overcoming the COVID problem. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let's now turn to Philippa Amanta. Again, a reminder, she is from the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies in Indonesia.
Thanks, Matt. Here from Indonesia, I am more cautiously optimistic than Dr. Sarath. I think here in Indonesia, we're seeing lots of opportunities for Indonesia to move towards fair trade, especially through the growing numbers of trade agreements that we've already had. For example, we've engaged in about 22 bilateral and also regional trade agreements, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnerships, the latest one with EFTA countries, the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreements, and we still have more that are currently under negotiations or under exploration. But at the same time, we all know that this trend towards preferential trade agreements also carries the risk that it is steering us away from making any significant unilateral trade liberalizations. Economists agree in the grand scheme of things, unilateral policies are more efficient and beneficial than if you have preferential trade agreements that would result in significant trade diversion risks, for example. But still, thinking positively, though, trade agreements that we are having so far are pushing Indonesia and Indonesians to be more accepting of free trade, and also starting the conversation about the importance of imports. And I do believe that to some extent, they help strengthen trade here in Indonesia. But with that being said, we also think that we should continue the effort to push for unilateral trade liberalizations, such as by eliminating non-tariff measures, which Center for Indonesian Policy Studies have been working on. So in Indonesia, as in so many other countries, the number of non-tariff measures have actually increased as tariffs have decreased globally. So these are the new trade challenges that we have to address right now. While we celebrate the successes of the trade agreements, we still cannot forget about the push for unilateral liberalization as well. That's from the Indonesian perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll hear from Prashant Narang from the Center for Civil Society in India.
Thanks, Matt. So yeah, I'm optimistic to some extent. And my reason for optimism is the Indian agriculture policy of 2018. Here I'm focusing only on agriculture. The policy, it signals an intent of shifting away from protectionism and moving towards trade liberalization to some extent. And in fact, there are three key objectives of this policy. One is the policy intends to identify zero restriction products, which means that there would be no export restrictions for processed agriculture goods and all kinds of organic products. So number two is that, for the purpose of food security, and food security has traditionally been the ground for imposing trade restrictions, especially on agricultural commodities. So the policy is very clear that food security may be an issue, but however, for food security, you may need to focus only on selected and fewer agriculture commodities. It doesn't need to be whole gamut of agriculture commodities. So identify a few commodities that are essential for food security in consultation with relevant ministries, and then only on those commodities there should be export restriction, but that export restriction should be in extreme price situation, which means that only in rare circumstances you should have export restriction, which we welcome. I think that's a very good move towards trade liberalization. It's an incremental approach. It's not a radical reform, but if implemented, it would still be a good move towards liberalization. And third is, and very crucial, and that the policy acknowledges that to have robust exports, you need to allow imports. Import substitution doesn't work. So if you want a good export share in the world market, you have to first allow for imports. And why? Because unless you allow imports, you can't produce high quality export items that are worth exporting. So there is recognition and there is realization in the policy to that extent, and I think that's a very good shift as far as agriculture exports are concerned. The problem in India is, especially onion is considered to be an essential kitchen commodity in Indian kitchens and Indian households. So much so that onion prices can stimulate the election results. So if the onions are very expensive around elections, the ruling party is going to really have a bad time. And so therefore, political parties are very sensitive, especially the ruling parties are usually very sensitive to onion prices. And therefore, there are often ad hoc bans on onions as well as on other agriculture commodities apart from basmati rice. Now, what it does is that it breaks the export supply chains, and it affects the country's image as a reliable supplier. And I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because the policy now acknowledges this thing, and it's written in the policy that we really need to limit our government intervention and use it only in the rarest cases. And so, that's good. Plus, of course, we had farm reforms, although most of the farm reforms are targeted at the domestic ease of farming within the domestic, market. And for farmers, it means a lot. However, there are a couple of things. So, for example, there was an amendment under the farm reforms to the Essential Commodities Act, which means that the government cannot do ad hoc bans on the export of certain commodities. So while it doesn't do away with, it hasn't completely scrapped government's power to tinker with exports, but to some extent, there is sort of a buffer and there is some more guidance as to what government can do and what government can't do. So some more guidance and some sort of speed breaker there. which I think is good thing. So these two positive developments, the export policy and the amendment to Essential Commodities Act, I think these are two major reasons for our optimism here in India, as far as agriculture exports are concerned.
Great, thank you. Well, as some may not know, many of the think tanks around the world who have been working on trade have been getting together through Atlas Network's Global Voices for Open Trade program. And it's just a great cohort of really hard-charging, interesting, thoughtful think tank leaders such as yourselves, and many of you have participated, just getting together and explaining what you're up to and what you're learning, and trying to get feedback on different things. So in that same spirit, I wondered if each of you could talk about some practical things that you've learned. I mean, some of the big challenges that you've each talked about already include, of course, just kind of the way we think about trade, some of the myths that make some particular politicians just afraid of liberalization and its association in their minds with a colonial past. On the other hand, there's the sort of getting in the weeds of sort of endless bilateral trade negotiations and making progress, but also wondering if the big picture is really being addressed. And then, of course, thinking about whether people at their kitchen tables are connecting with again, with the big picture around what free trade can do for the country as a whole, without being myopic about particular issues or commodities such as onions. I don't know if this is relevant, but it just reminded me that earlier in my career, I met with an attorney who was passionate about challenging the U.S. government's ban on futures trading for onions. So that was another sort of pro-liberty stance. Why did we carve out a ban on trading futures for onions? It's such an odd thing, but I think it does speak to the sort of Byzantine and bizarre hodgepodge of policies that can restrict economic freedom when government is too responsive to different constituencies for different reasons. So I think, broadly speaking, a think tank that takes on free trade, it's such an important topic. As I said at the beginning, it eclipses so many other issues, but yet at the same time, I think it can be overwhelming. So let's go through in whichever order you guys would like to respond on just some practical lessons and advice for other think tanks who are either getting started in this space or thinking of getting started in this important topic.
Can I come in? I heard three very important things that I agree with 100%. First of all, that as you said from Indonesia, there is no way you can promote exports without liberalizing imports. Even if you didn't use any imported inputs into your export production, simply because when you put a restriction on import to produce import substitutes, then you make that activity profitable. So where do the resources come in order to expand? From non-tradable goods and exports. So that's a real no-no. If countries like our country believes in that, or used to believe that they are promoting exports, they ask me, why are you worried about imports? You want to increase imports, but they don't realize the connection. That's the first point. Second thing, I also like to hear that free trade agreements are not free trade, actually. We have signed 4 agreements, one with India, the most important one, and we are still discussing various things about it. Now, many countries who had these free trade agreements, including, say, Mexico and United States, they are trading outside the agreement. I mean, the point is the costs are high, going through the hoops and things through the agreement, that they are prepared to pay 20% duty and still be profitable to sell in the United States from Mexico, for example. And so, other thing, I have seen one in Bolivia signed 26 agreements And people believe that, even people that I know, I have to say, they like many agreements. That's a disaster because you have 26 agreements with 26 rules of origin that change over time. And I showed to them that they can't go anywhere. The person who makes a decision how much to charge as a custom duty is given a great menu to make money. So you say, oh, you got this under this agreement. If you can put it under the other agreement, then we can give you 20% where you and I can share it. So it's really not workable and it doesn't really work. And actually there is nothing as superior for trade reform as doing it unilaterally. All the countries that have succeeded in reforming their trade did it unilaterally. That's why Chile was able to succeed. Sri Lanka succeeded to a large extent, and certainly countries like South Korea succeeded in spades. So we may have to sort of go after some of these ill-conceived ideas people have. Also, I think I would begin by saying, what do you mean by liberalization? People don't really understand that. They think that allowing imports to come free to your country. They don't understand the main idea as advanced by Bhagwati and Krieger in their famous studies on liberalizing trade. The liberalization is just the act of allowing prices to determine your exports and imports. That's it. You don't have to stop any, you don't have to open your thing. It's not a freedom of the wild ass, as the lawyers say. It's let people buy and sell unrestricted. That's what we need. And that's not a great, difficult thing to do if you agree to do it. And we have a system of laws and rules. As I think in the sort of practice session, I said, we have a great new Director General in Ngozi, who I work together with her in the bank. She's very good. She's very smart. And so, and also she's also saying we got to bring the WTA rules to the 21st century, and we should. So that should be an area that we can also devote from our places in the think tanks. Thank you.
If I may jump in, because I absolutely agree with what Dr. Sarath was saying about the need to push for unilateral trade liberalization, which is what we've been doing at Center for Indonesian Policy Studies, focusing on specifically non-tariff measures. As I said, non-tariff measures have significantly increased. Just numbers alone, non-tariff measures on food and agriculture commodities in particular have increased by 27%. But talking about the numbers alone underplay the effect that it has on trade, because it's such a complex trade measures and has layers and details in its implementations that it really disrupts trade flows, quantity, and also price, and disrupts the market. So we are trying to explain the complexities of non-tariff measures in layman terms so that policymakers can understand, not just policymakers, but the public itself, so that we can garner public support towards a fair trade. And we're trying as best as we can to translate all of these trade disruptions to arguments that people can understand. So for example, we measured how non-tariff measures in Indonesia's food and agriculture commodities are estimated to be an equivalent to about 49% tariff. So that puts our understanding to perspective, right? It's not just a qualitative thing that you have to fulfill, but it actually costs businesses and importers, which ultimately also costs the consumers. And that's what we're trying to convey. And the recent papers that we've published, which thank you so much, Chelsea, for dropping the link in the chat box if people are interested in reading. But we try to explain the benefits of unilateral trade liberalization when we remove or eliminate the unnecessary non-tariff measures. We calculated that, for example, if you remove non-tariff measures on rice and beef, you can potentially reduce food prices by 39%. Wow. And that will in turn push poverty down by like 2.8 percentage points. And that is important to explain to people how eliminating non-tariff measures and doing all of these trade liberalization will actually help us reduce poverty numbers, especially now during the pandemic when there are a serious poverty problem that we're facing. And then the second point, Matt made a good point about there's tons of myths that are still prevalent that are preventing policymakers from being responsive to free trade ideas. And that's something that we had to learn, that we cannot just ignore these myths, but we have to address the countering argument head on to disprove the myths surrounding trade liberalization. For example, similar to what Prashant was saying about onions in India, here in Indonesia, that would be rice, that are extremely important for political reasons, both from the farmers' political votes to also the consumers. When it comes to election season, the price of rice is extremely important for Indonesia. And of course, the biggest counter argument to trade that people often have is that how will open trade affect producers? How will it affect farmers? That's the big question that we often receive. So we decided to address that head on, and we look at, okay, then if we do open trade and we're getting all of these wonderful poverty reduction and also consumption increases, what will happen to farmers? And we were looking at how even if we remove all of the trade restrictions on rice, it actually will only reduce self-sufficiency rates from close to 100% to about 90%. So the impact is actually often exaggerated, but of course it's not without any reason. So we are complementing that with, okay, we will have to open trade to get all of these wonderful benefits, but at the same time, we also need to increase our own competitiveness, of course, through, as Dr. Sarat said, opening imports through agriculture inputs, for example, modernizing it through trade and investments in the sector, all of that, just to help farmers. And lastly, we also mentioned to the policymakers that actually the poverty reduction that I mentioned in the beginning, that's largest in actually rural areas. So the poverty reduction will benefit farmers most, that are also benefiting from lower food prices. So trying to describe non-tariff measures and all of these trade jargons in key messages that people can understand, for example, poverty, farmers' income, all of that, I think that had really helped us trying to spread the message of trade liberalization in Indonesia.
Prashant.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Selling free trade as an idea is also not easy. It's quite difficult to sell, because when you say export restrictions are bad for farmers and import restrictions are bad for consumers, government would say, yes, we understand that. Free imports are bad for farmers and free exports are bad for consumers. And so, it becomes very difficult to explain and make a case for free trade. So then you need to show that the net impact, or overall, that it's net positive for society as a whole. But how would you say that? The other thing is, I think it's quite important for us to pay attention to the political discourse and the political economy. So to understand what is happening, and I agree with Philippa, what happens with rice and onions, because these are such common commodities. So you have farmers on one hand and you have consumers on the other hand, and farmers unite. They form a lobby group, and they vote as a group. Yeah. So of course, then their interest, for example, be it subsidies or minimum prices, these become political issues. Whereas consumers are not likely to vote in bloc unless, of course, there is onion scarcity. They will, but only in extreme circumstances. Whereas for farmers, it's a livelihood issue. And subsidies and minimum support prices, etc., from year to year after year or season after season, these are election issues. It's very, very difficult to break this political economy, so much so that in India, even though we had farm reforms, the farmers' lobby are on roads for past 1 year, almost 1 year. They are still on the roads, blocking roads, opposing farm reforms, because they fear that the minimum support prices that they have been getting so far, that system would vanish. So when we pay attention to the political discourse, this is very interesting, because what the government has tried to do Instead of making it a trade issue, they say we want to double farmers' income by 2022. And how do you double farmers' income? You need to, you can only double farmers' income when you expand the market, which means that, allow for more exports. And then they acknowledge that to have more exports, you need to export high value goods, you need to export more processed goods. And to have high quality processed goods, you have to also allow for imports. You can't have just import substitution. So that understanding has played well, by having a popular rhetorical message that we want to double farmers' income by 2022. So that's good. However, the problem is, the government, on the other hand, in general, for other sectors, has been propagating the message of Atmanirbharta. It's a Hindi Sanskrit word, which what it means can be debatable. Swaminathan Iyer argues that we need to distinguish between the meaning, because the way government has sometimes been interpreting Atmanirbharta as self-sufficiency. And his argument is that it's not self-sufficiency, it's self-reliance. So for example, I don't grow my food, I don't stitch my clothes, because if I start doing that, I'll have to move to a forest to be able to do all my, to grow all my needs on my own. And it's just not possible. So what you need to do is you do what you specialize at, and then you make money, and then you buy whatever you need to from other people who specialize at producing that. And of course, we all know about theory of comparative advantage by Ricardo. So the word Atmanirbharta needs to be interpreted and be understood in light of the theory of comparative advantage, that it's not self-sufficiency, it's rather self-reliance. Because self-sufficiency leads to poverty, and self-reliance leads to prosperity. I think that messaging we need to kind of, with the government, clarify and put that in popular discourse. So I think somewhere I agree with McCloskey that it's also about rhetoric and not just about economics.
Oh, thank you very much for that. As we go into our last question, I want to remind our audience that if you have any questions for our panel, please submit them in the chat and we'll try to get to them in the time we have left. Yeah, it does seem that, we have to face the challenges of the way that many of these ideas are thought about, and the perceived effects that they're going to have, and try to think through and preempt some of those concerns to more effectively advance a free trade agenda. Not easy, and certainly requires going beyond making just the free trade argument, but to make a more of a holistic political economy argument. With that in mind, let's leave the last question on giving all of us a sense of what's next for your organization. Where do you see a specific opportunity for either research or kind of a particular measure that will be of great advantage if you focus on? Give us a sense of what we can be looking for if this panel inspires us. I know I follow each of you, but maybe some additional audience members want to stay in touch and watch and see what's coming out of your shops next. In whatever order you'd like, share with us a little glimpse of what to expect from your organizations on the issue of trade over the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah. Our group, Advocata, has devoted resources, substantial amount of resources to the issues of trade. We have 2 or 3 projects that are going on, analysis. We also realized that we had to be able to communicate those things very well. Not only the understanding our understanding the issues, but we had to be able to communicate them. So we had to translate it into Sinhala, because since the 1960s and 70s, we got rid of English. We teach most of our courses in the university in Sinhala. So you can imagine what it has done to knowledge. So the whole conduit of knowledge that comes from foreign language is now denied to us. One day I'm going to write a book about it and become very unpopular, but I will do it. So that is one thing we are doing. And also you have said that there's a connections that you have made very well. Those connections, what will happen if we, and horrible things are not going to happen if you liberalize trade. We have more access to goods and services cheaper, right? And also we will also, it turns out that if you are a liberal economy, if people can predict, the outsiders can predict, there are a lot of FDI could come in. You know, we have fairly good population, well educated, about very high literacy rates. So we have to make those connections about it means for poverty, for example. A lot of people think that the government is going to help people, pull people out of poverty. They won't be able to do it without the measures that we advocate. They can't be giving subsidy. For example, Sri Lankan agriculture is very highly subsidized. We have guaranteed prices that are above world prices. We have free fertilizer. We don't charge for water and other inputs that go into things. We subsidize seeds. And so it is, we subsidize very, very much. On the other hand, I'll just give you a very simple ratio to imagine what happened to agriculture. 27% in our population, 27% of our people, right? That's the way, are in agriculture. But their contribution to GDP is only 7%. So you can imagine how low our productivity is. 27% of our population in agriculture, they produce only 7% of our GDP. And there's no need for it to be in that state unless the government takes its hands out of it and gives more freedom from imports. And there's certain help at the very beginning. I have no difficulty with that, but it's a very inefficient agriculture. As I know, I worked on Indonesia. I used to lead the World Bank mission there in 1981-83 period. You had a very good agriculture, 4% GDP growth, agriculture GDP growth over 20 years, which is an example of a country that was doing very well. And you had bullock that subsidized prices very well. And so I don't know what happened. There are things we can do. The most important thing we can do is that during the war, LTT war, we imposed a lot of taxes because we didn't have money to carry on the war. And those taxes are still there. And I have been arguing in the forums, including government forums, why are we keeping these so-called para-tariffs? Then the Ministry of Finance says, no, we can't afford. I say, but we are misallocating our resources royally, and you are talking about tax revenue. Actually, if you get growth going, tax revenue will increase even better than what we are doing at the moment. So there are issues that are special to us. Improving agriculture, we have to modernize agriculture. We had to try to turn our agriculture into export agriculture. We had a very successful export agriculture, tea, rubber, and coconut plantation crop. We were the leaders in it. We have lost that position. And we have very silly rules. A farmer that is working in paddy area, for example, cannot switch to another crop, even if that were profitable for him or her, without asking the district commissioner whether he can do it. I mean, this is ridiculous. So there are things that we can do. Those things we can really bring to light. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Before we turn to Prashant and Philippa, I want to make one quick announcement. We've extended this session to 6:25. Hopefully that's okay with the panelists. Can consider it a sign of our deep interest in what you have to say here. And then I'm going to introduce one of the chat questions just in case one of you wants to incorporate it into your next comments. But Dean writes, apart from the more basic arguments against free trade, a more perhaps substantive objection to free trade comes from the perceived success of industrial policy, particularly in East Asia. Is there anything some of the Asian think tanks can do to combat this together? I'm reminded of a William Easterly paper where he demonstrates that the risks of picking winners in a development context is actually even higher for countries who are working to move from low middle income, and up. It becomes even riskier the more that you are in a sort of a development setting. The risk of being wrong, making a risky bet on whatever industries you're looking at. And then there's other good research that's some of the more robust industrial policy has been properly demonstrated to be faulty, but there's research showing that even marginal, okay, well, we can just do a little industrial policy, that has big inefficiencies. So, the evidence is on the side of resisting industrial policy, but it still maintains a bit of an allure for some of the obvious reasons, but of course, some mistaken thinking about what some of the successful countries over the last 30, 40 years have achieved in terms of economic growth. There's a misinterpretation that came in part because of industrial policy. So feel free to incorporate that in your comments about what you're doing next, and then we'll use the last 10 minutes to cover this. So Prashant or Philippa?
Shall I say, because we have in our work program a piece on industrial policy. My preface to that argument discussion is simply this. Industrial policy is what people want to do when they want liberalized trade. Okay? And when somebody tells me about industrial policy, I know, this guy doesn't want to liberalize trade. He doesn't want like the competition. Now, I am very interested in people who are the people who are making the decision where to invest. Most of the time, this is some hack politician who you put gains or something from it. Sorry, can I? So the countries that are
feedback.
Yeah. Can I continue?
Yes. Sorry, we had an interruption. Yeah, go ahead and wrap up quickly so we can move to Prashant and Philippa.
Yeah, so industrial policy itself is quite dangerous becoming captured by people. It can be easily captured. And we'll give you an example of Japan that it's supposed to have done industrial policy. Research by other very good economists looking at Japan found that the largest subsidies went to the industries that they're promoting. And also MITI, that's the last thing I'm going to say. MITI told people trying to produce the Toyotas, no, that is not, you should not be doing that. So Toyota ignored it and produced, and that's another story. That is one of the most sought after brands in the world. So it is not a very good thing. The basis for it is not very properly laid out. So that's my.
Thank you. Okay, the balance of time is now for you, Philippa and Prashant. Please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Matt. I want to answer one of Dr. Sarat's question earlier as well about whatever happened to Indonesia's agriculture that once was so successful, and trade restrictions is what happens. For example, we can say in the case of rice, we remain about 99% of 100% supplying our rice from domestic production, but it's very inefficient. Our rice production costs about 2.5 times more expensive than rice produced in Vietnam, and partly because we restrict import for important inputs like hybrid rice seeds that have higher yields and more resilient. So that's one of the priorities that we want to advance after this, which is to really hammer down the argument that to increase export, you will need to import. That's the same case for agriculture. That's also the same case for industry, manufacturing industry. To answer some of the questions in the chat box, for example, we are working on several papers that are addressing Indonesia's industrial policy. Right now, we have policies that prioritize import substitution policy, which we know doesn't work. And the other policy is on commodity balance sheet for industry imports. And we're working on some papers on that, trying to explain to the Ministry of Industry and Ministry of Trade that to increase export, you really need to first open up your import. And then the second priority that we have at CHIPS is right now to maximize the benefits of trade agreements. You will need to do structural reforms first domestically. This is trying to go with the trend of increasing trade agreements in Indonesia and also around the world. But we want to make the point that trade agreements alone are not enough. You have to still do some unilateral policies, structural reforms to allow for a more open trade, to allow for a more open investment policies that does not have all of these import substitution restrictions, so that you can actually maximize the benefits of all of the trade agreements that have been negotiated. So that's have been some of our previous work. I'll share some more interesting briefs on, for example, our board member, Budona Gultom, who's also here, wrote a very interesting brief on how Indonesia can maximize the benefits of RCEP through structural agreements. And that's something that we will continue doing with new trade agreements coming in.
Thanks, Philippa. At Center for Civil Society, we want to this year focus on imports of genetically modified seeds. I think actually, while the world has moved to the latest genetically modified technology, especially in agriculture, India has not really embraced GM seeds. In very few crops, I think it was only cotton, and very reluctantly India had allowed earlier, but for many other crops, so far the ministry hasn't allowed. And it also remains a concern as far as rule of law is concerned, because the regime for giving consent is also a gray area as to when the ministry is supposed to give consent to a genetically modified seed, what sort of trials will be done, and then whether it will still have the discretion to ban GM seeds. This is highly contentious here in India. So we want to pick up on this issue so that in the agriculture, the productivity for a farmer can also go up.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all of you for your great comments. If you in the audience are interested in learning more about the Global Voices for Open Trade program at Atlas Network, you can visit our grants page, and it's not only an opportunity to support your work in the area of free trade, but also to participate in a really lively and rich cohort of peers who are interested in helping each other and learning from each other and challenging each other to tackle this issue and get to new heights. There's probably nothing more bang for the buck in terms of improving standards of living for people around the world than increasing trade. And so it's an area that all of us have an opportunity to become even more versed in. Experts like these that we got to hear from today are great to work with and collaborate with. I hope you can reach out to them to the extent that that they have availability. But I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to be learning from each other and working together. We have some resources here in terms of not just financial support, but some of the trade experts that we've gotten to know who come and participate and give feedback in our cohort session. So with that, we will close today. I want to thank Philippa and Dr. Sarath and Prashant. Always a pleasure to learn about what you're doing. It's encouraging, big challenges to tackle without a doubt, but the three of you give me confidence, and I look forward to seeing all of you throughout other sessions during this great forum that is special because of you. So thank you for being part of it. Have a great day.